Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled Workflow Execution Interface, or WEI, Streamlining Autonomous Scientific Discovery Through Open Source Robotics and Instrumentation Integration. My name is Nick Jans of OpenTrons, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Today's educational web seminar is presented by LabRoots and sponsored by OpenTrons. For more information about OpenTron's liquid handling automated solutions, please visit opentrons.com. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone that this event is interactive, and we encourage you to first participate by communicating with other attendees using our live chat feature during the presentation. You can find the live chat located at the left of your screen. If you have any trouble seeing or hearing the presentation, click on the Help Desk button located at the top of your screen within the navigation bar or from the lobby within the events. Now let's get started. I would personally like to introduce Casey Stone, who I've had the pleasure in working with over the past several years. Casey holds a Bachelor in Science in Biology from Indiana University, a Master's in Science in Computer Science from the University of Chicago, and currently holds the position of Computational Scientist in Data Science and Learning Division at Argonne National Laboratory. For a complete biography on our speakers, please visit the Presenter tab from the menu on the left of your screen. And with that, Casey, you can take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Nick, for the introduction. So as Nick said, I am a computational scientist at Argonne National Lab. I do a lot of work in many projects at Argonne, but the one I'll be talking about today is a software stack we've developed. Me and my group at the Rapid Prototyping Lab have developed called the Workflow Execution Interface, or WEI for short, which is just a software stack that allows us to more easily integrate different pieces of robotics and pull in AI and pull in data management so that we can hook AI and robotic labs together to do science in an autonomous way. So I'll click next. Okay, before I get into the presentation, I want to mention that a lot of what I'll be covering has been published in 2 of our papers. So the paper on the left, called Exploring Benchmarks for Self-Driving Labs in Color Matching, is a paper that describes a benchmark experiment that we've completed, where we pair AI and a robotic lab to autonomously mix printer inks. That's because in our rapid prototyping lab that we work in, we're not allowed to use chemicals, so we're using it as a benchmark. And it autonomously mixes inks to match a target color. And then our second paper, so the one on the right, called Towards a Modular Architecture for Science Factories, is a paper that describes our modular strategy toward robotic integration. So if you have any questions at the end of this presentation that aren't answered, looking at these 2 papers would be a great place to start, but you're always more than welcome to submit your questions to me through email. All right, so why is Argonne specifically interested in autonomous discovery? Argonne has some of the fastest supercomputers in the world, which will be especially true once the Aurora supercomputer comes online. And with those supercomputers, we're able to build better and better models to model our world and make predictions on science faster than ever before. And on the other side, right, we have robotic labs, and we've been making great progress in automating science, especially, that's especially evident in the pharmaceutical industry. But where we're lacking is the ability to connect the 2 in a way that allows artificial intelligence to influence the experiments being run on the robotic lab, and the robotic lab's data to influence, the weights of the models of the AI. So that's kind of where Argonne's interest in robotic integration and AI integration into automated labs comes in. The combination of the AI and the robotic labs is what we call autonomous discovery, and that's what Argonne has a huge push on right now. You can use AI to more intelligently scan the search space. You can learn patterns in the data and better pick which experiments to choose next. And then also the robotic lab can complete the experiments faster than ever before and send the data back. And it turns out that that autonomous discovery loop, is applicable to many domains of science. Everything from biology to battery science to environmental science. And that's what Argonne is working to apply autonomous discovery to. Okay, but when you look at everything that needs to be integrated in order to allow for autonomous discovery, you can see that it's much more complicated than just pairing AI with a robotic lab. First of all, I mean, you have to get all the instruments in the robotic lab working together, which is no easy task, and that's what I'll go through next. But you also need to consider tools such as data management. How do you pass data back and forth between the AI and the robotic lab? How do you do automatic processing on that data? How do you control the data if you need to for your experiment? And then how do you get AI to take in that data and update itself and then suggest the next round of experiments? So this is no easy task, and that's what our group at the Rapid Prototyping Lab at Argonne is working to allow and to help scientists achieve. Okay, so now we get into the section where I describe the workflow execution interface, which, as I said before, is the software stack that we've been developing to allow for this robotic integration with AI. Our group does more work on the robotic integration side and less on the AI side, but we try to make sure that those bridges and those connections are easily accessible, to scientists who may not even have a lot of background in computer science. So just to introduce the workflow execution interface, basically we've designed it to be a modular system, which I'll describe later. It's fully open source, right? Because we're a national lab, so we want to enable others to do this kind of automated experiment. Even groups who might not be able to afford, a proprietary solution. All of our code, since it is open source, is available at that GitHub repo to the right. So at our Argonne Self-Driving Labs repository. You can kind of see the two pinned repos there. So there's WEI, which is the workflow execution interface, and we have a template work cell to the right, which is kind of everything you need to get started and run a basic version of integrating two instruments, which would be your computer and a webcam in this case. Also, all the experimental logic is implemented in Python, so that makes it really easy and accessible for scientists who don't have a lot of computer science experience and don't need to know a lot of the details about how every instrument works. And also, it's integratable with the Globus ecosystem, which is what we use for data management and processing and passing that information back to an AI model. Okay, so if we're gonna set up a self-driving lab or just an automated lab, the first thing you would do, right, is you would start by purchasing the instruments that you need for your experiment. I have some examples of instruments that we work with on the bottom, some being an OpenTrons OT2, which is a liquid handling robot that kind of mimics the motions that you would do in biology with a hand pipette. We have a thermocycler, a ChemSpeed, a Hydex Sense, a Mir 250 mobile base, which can roll around the floor. And then we also, in our lab, we use a lot of robotic arms so that we can move labware in between these instruments. The problem with integrating these kind of instruments together is that oftentimes they come from different companies, and there's no standard amongst these companies about how they communicate with the instruments or how the instruments are meant to be used by the user, right? So some instruments are made to be robotic compatible, so they'll have a door on them that'll open automatically and allow for a robotic arm to enter, whereas others are meant to just help one bench scientist's life become a little easier, and they have a manual door that you have to open, and no coding API, that kind of thing. So how do we get all these pieces working together in a way where you can communicate to each of them in a standardized, uniform way? So if we look at the maybe two examples, so we've got the thermocycler and maybe the OpenTrons OT2, and we've got an arm that can transfer plates between them. So what we've done in order to make the communication standardized is we've added two software layers on top of the base communication layer that allow us to capture what's happening with the instrument and report it out and report out what actions that instrument can do to weigh in the weigh server, which I'll describe later. So the OpenTrons OT2, for example, the base communication layer would be Ethernet, whereas the thermocycler has to run on a Windows machine, and it has serial communication. What we do is on top of that, we have a driver level. So the driver level in this diagram is the middle layer. Sometimes this driver, the driver is what will send the commands to the instrument to actually make it move or do the functions that it's supposed to do. So for OpenTrons, they provide a Python API, which is great, and you can code against, and you can have it aspirate and dispense from different locations. Whereas the thermocycler is since it runs on Windows, we wrote a C# driver to have it accomplish all those tasks. But the problem with the driver is that the driver is meant to speak that Ethernet or serial language, and the driver is not necessarily standardized between instrument. Also, in order to make it easier, we tend to use, if the company provides one, we tend to use that first, just to prevent duplicating effort. So what we do to standardize it is on top of that, we put a client layer, which we have, we've been experimenting with different client layers, but we've converged on using REST API because it's pretty simple and it's applicable to all of our instruments. And what that REST API will do is it will broadcast to the system or to the weigh server what actions each instrument is able to do. And then if it receives that command, so for example, if OpenTrons receives a command that says run protocol, it'll send that command down to the driver level, the Python, along with the file, and then it'll run that and it'll pass that file to run across the Ethernet connection. Another thing I'd like to say is I think a good way to visualize the difference between the driver and the client is with a robotic arm. So a lot of robotic arms in the driver that the company provides, you'll have access to pretty much every motion that robotic arm can do. So, open, close gripper, move to this location, move along one axis, all these different commands that you can access. But the user who's running an experiment doesn't need access to all of those commands. Maybe they just need access to a transfer function. So there'll be a transfer function in the client that will then translate that into individual commands that it runs in the driver and then passes that command to the instrument. Okay, so here is just a little more detail on what the software stacks look like for each instrument. The collection of the instrument and then the driver level and the client level is what we call a module. And so in our attempt to make this a modular system, we want the software for each instrument to be completely isolated from the other instruments so that you can add in instruments to the system and take them away kind of just like Lego blocks. There's nothing connecting them together. They won't know if another one is gone and another one has been replaced. So the picture to the left is actually two modules. So there's a sealer and a peeler. Each of those has their own software layers on top, but they've just been paired together on a cart, which is kind of our hardware attempt at modularity, because they have actions that are similar to each other. You probably wouldn't want to seal something without the ability to peel it. Okay, so on the diagram to the right, we can see at the very bottom, the green, we have the machine. So the base layer is just the machine itself. So in this case, it would be a peeler. Then you have the intrinsic hardware software interface. For the peeler, that's just a USB connection. That's what I was talking about, is the base layer communication in the previous slide. And then above that, you'll have the instrument driver. So that's what will send the communication across that USB connection. We've added some functionality to that driver, such as an action handler, which will handle receiving the action from the client and passing it down to the driver. Things like a status handler, which will tell us if the instrument is currently active or if it's idle and ready to receive a command. And then also a resource handler, which will handle, how much peeling tape does the peeler have left, and has it run out? And if it has run out, it'll switch the status, to be an error state or something. Okay, on top of that, we have the client level REST API, which will expose the actions that that module can do to the rest of the system. And then we have added some functionality to that, such as about, which will, broadcast what the instrument is and what it's able to do to the rest of the system. The state, which will broadcast, is it ready to receive a command? Is it in an error state, etc. We have resources, which is the same thing. Does it have enough peeling tape? And then the actions that it's able to do, or an action command is actually where it receives the action from the system, and then it will pass it down to the machine. Okay, so once we have each of our instruments, and we have these software layers on top of them, and we have each of them built into modules, how do we combine them in a way that allows us to do an actual science experiment? So the way that we've been thinking about it is that modules can be combined into what we call work cells. So a work cell is just a collection of modules that can run one or more experiments. On the left, you can see a cart-based work cell that we have in the RPL. This is because, as I said, we're experimenting with the idea of hardware modularity as well. So how we want science labs that can be reconfigurable as the needs of the experiment change. This is because we want AI to be able to influence the design and the running of the experiment, and so we want it to also be able to influence what instruments it has available to itself. To the right, we have an example of a compact work cell in the Biosciences Division, which I also oversee. There, we don't have the luxury of space like we do in the RPL, so everything is kind of put together on a tabletop, but the same software works in both instances, which is great because I know a lot of science needs to happen in a fume hood, and you don't have the luxury of making your modules actually plug in and out like Lego pieces. But the same software works in both cases. Okay, so how do we, if we're defining our work cell, how do we let the system know what instruments are available? So we do this by creating a work cell definition file. So this is just a YAML formatted file. And an example of one is to the left, where in this example, there's a PF400, which is a robotic arm, and then an OpenTrons OT2. So you can see under the modules section, you just have the name of the instrument, the model number, what interface that you use. As I said, we're using REST API for most of our modules, so it's a WEI REST node. But you don't have to use REST. You could use, and we do support, ROS1, ROS2. You could use Blue Sky or Epix, anything you need. But we've just found REST to be useful in our situations. And then a configuration, which is the port at which you will send action requests to the REST node. Same thing with OT2. It's also a WEI REST node, and then it has an address listed. So you just need to tell the system how to send commands to the instruments. Other than that, the robots don't know about the existence of each other. Okay, so then you also need to specify locations. So this is any locations that need to be used by the system. And in this case, the PF400 is the only one we need to define locations for, because if we're sending a protocol to the OT2, the OT2 is already going to know, intrinsically where position 1, position 2 is. We don't need to tell it. Whereas the PF400, we need to specify locations that we want it to reach. So for the PF400, we have 2 locations defined, a PF400 exchange location, which is how we bring in labware to the system. So we would grab it from an exchange location, and then we could transfer it with a transfer command, which I'll show later, to the OT2 deck, which we also defined. That's just one position on the OT2 deck, even though there are multiple. So I know that example only had 2 instruments, but we do have a lot of other modules developed on the GitHub repo that I mentioned earlier, and the link is in the bottom right of the slide. All of these instruments listed here, we have full modules for, and if you happen to have the same instruments, you're welcome to, pull down the code and try out our system and get your, robots integrated together. Okay, so here I went a little bit into the right side of this diagram already. This is an overall WEI architecture diagram. So if you look on the right, you've got your devices in gray, and then you've got your work cell, which is a combination of modules, and then the module sends communication to the device. That's what I just described. But I want to talk now about the WEI server and how scientists can submit experiments to run to the WEI server and how that gets passed to the work cell. So as I was saying, I was talking more about the work cell and device section, but now I'm going to talk about the WEI server a little bit. So the WEI server, the way we've designed it, it's kind of separated out from the work cell layer and also separated from the experimenter side in green. It uses a REST API, and the beauty of it being separated is that it's more robust to errors and issues and client-level problems. So if the scientist does something wrong on the green side, which I'll talk about in a second, it won't cause the WEI server to go down. Similarly, if an instrument fails or if an instrument goes into an error state on the side in blue, the work cell side, it will also not cause the WEI server to go down. So the WEI server is supposed to be robust. It handles managing the instruments and data and passing the commands back and forth. Also, it handles experimental logging. So it can report back to the experimenter a full log of everything that happened and every action that was done on the robots, and if those actions happen successfully. All right, so now I want to talk a little bit about how an experimenter would write their experiment and how they would submit it to the WEI server so that it can run on an automated lab. And we want this experimenter side to be separate from the work cell because we don't want, people who have the skills to write these experiments aren't necessarily computer scientists that would know the details of how to run every single device. We don't want the same person to have knowledge of this entire system. We want to make it more approachable to everyone. Okay, so how would a scientist write commands? So we have what we call workflow files, which are, again, a YAML formatted file. And a workflow file is just a sequence of steps to be executed on a given work cell to complete a scientific task. We think of workflows as not an entire experiment, but as a contained sequence of steps that you could think about running repeatedly. So for example, I have an experiment in the Biosciences Division where basically the two main sections of the experiment are we create assay plates, so we mix liquids together, and then we read them, right? So I have two workflows. I have one for creating the plate and one for reading the plate so that I can run both of those at the same time, but each section is a linear sequence of steps. That'll become, I think, clearer a little bit later. And each step in that workflow file specifies one action to be performed on a specific module. So if we look at the workflow file to the right, we can see it has two modules are present in this workflow. So we're just saying, these are the modules I'll be running. When we set up the WEI server, we define what work cell it will work on. So if we submit this workflow to that version of the WEI server, it'll check to make sure it has those instruments available to run this workflow. So we have an OT2 and we have a PR400. So under the flow def section, we can see that the first action is we want to move a plate from the exchange point onto the OT2. So what module are we using? We're using the PR400 was the action we want to do. The action is a transfer. And then we have certain arguments that we pass in. So where's the source? So we want to go from the exchange location to the target, which is the OT2 deck. And then we have some specifics like which orientation is the plate in so that we know how to grab the plate correctly with the robotic arm. Also, so the next action would be to mix solutions on the OT2. So the module is the OT2 CP gamma, which is just what we call that specific OT2. the action is run protocol, which brings me to my next point. So some instruments have what we call protocol files, which are it defines an instrument-specific set of actions. So for example, if we want to run a certain protocol on the OT2, our workflow action is run protocol, but we can pass it a file, which is that Python formatted file that can execute on the OT2. This just makes it easier so we don't have to pull out every possible command into our client level module. So another thing we can do is we can pass in payload values, which I'll talk about in the next slide. But payload is really just a way of injecting different variables into a workflow. So the workflow sequence can be generally the same, but you could change certain variables about it each time. And that's what allows us to bring in input from AI and change the experiment and update it every round. All right, so then we have our experiment application. So our experiment application is a Python file. It doesn't have to be. You can access the WEI server however you want. We've just made it Python to make it more accessible for scientists, because Python is a pretty popular and generally easy to use language. But the experiment application submits one or more workflows to WEI and encodes any logic required to manage and run the experiment. So there's no set way you need to write this Python file. It's not like you have to follow a template. It's just you can add in any logic that you want. Python makes it pretty easy to add loops and inject different decision points. But to the right is just a basic version of a Python file, a Python application file. So your format steps in your application file are: you need to define the experiment object that will communicate with WEI. Then you need to point to a workflow file. So we just have our example workflow.yaml. And then the third command there is what will actually run the workflow. And then you can also fetch out the results and save it to your local directory. Or this is where you could pass it to another computer, or have it, a supercomputer, or have it accessible by AI. Here is an example, just kind of an overview of one specific application that we run in the rapid prototyping lab. I mentioned in the slide about the two papers, I mentioned the first one, which is our color picker application, which autonomously mixes printer inks and analyzes an image of the results in a loop to recreate the target color. So if you look at this diagram here, you can see in the blue, we would have the experiment application level. So we can inject loops. So you see there's a loop there where we're looping on mixing the color. We can add decision points where we check if we've reached the target color, and we can run a different workflow depending on that decision point. The green would be the workflow level. So we have a workflow. The top one would be to get a new plate. So if there's no labware available, we would need to get a new piece of labware to use. And then the actions would be in pink. So if there's no labware to use, we would need to get a plate and then transfer it to the staging area. The second workflow is our mixed color workflow. So once we have that new plate, we can start running this loop where we're mixing colors and trying to hit that target color. So the actions there would be, transferring from our staging area to our OT2, running the program where we can combine the inks. The volumes of the different inks are injected through that payload mechanism that I mentioned. And that's how the AI changes the volumes of inks to be mixed each time. And then we would transfer that plate from the OT2 back to the camera, where we would take a picture of the inks that we just mixed, and then see how far we are away from that target color by transferring the data back to the AI. And then once we've completed that loop, we would run a workflow to trash the plate because we're done with it. Okay, I just want to quickly mention, so a lot of what I talked about is more on the instrument integration side, but we do want to make it easy for scientists to transfer that data back to whatever computer they need, whether that be a supercomputer or their local computer. And the way we do that is we make WEI compatible with Globus services, which is another project that came out of Argonne. And actually, some of my colleagues in the RPL were on that project, like Raf Escovi. So that's what enables you to transfer your data back to data storage. It enables rapid analysis on that data, so you can run your data through a series of analysis steps automatically. And you can, Globus also provides an authentication layer, so you can more easily control who has access to your data, or you can make it publicly available to anyone that has the link to the web page. And here's an example of what you can do with Globus services and our color picker application. So on the left, you can see the web page that we've created for ourselves. So you can see the target color is green, and then the best color we've reached so far over the looping is pretty close. And what this allows you to do is process the data and visualize what's happening in real time, however you want, which is a great tool, and it's easily available online to anyone who has access to your data. Okay, so a lot of what I already described is what we have completed at Argonne, but my team is a rapid prototyping lab, so we're trying to experiment with how we think about science and how we think about developing an automated lab, a flexible, modular, automated lab of the future. So I'm going to talk about some things we're experimenting with now. So one of the things we're looking at is, I've been talking a lot about running experiments on one work cell, but what if we want to run an experiment on multiple work cells and have them be coordinated and have supplies transferred to and from the work cells? How do we do that? So we're experimenting with mobile robotics. Another thing is that the runtime on a work cell right now is limited by the number of supplies that we can stack and are accessible by that robotic arm. But how would we think about bringing in more supplies to the system and taking out the used supplies when it's done? And for that, again, we're using mobile robotics, but we have kind of a robotic arm attached to a mobile base that will roam around and dock itself to the modules and bring supplies in and out. Oop. Okay. Another thing we're experimenting with, and my colleague Rory, who's a PhD student at UChicago, is doing a lot of work on, is the idea of virtual work cells. So we can visualize what a work cell will look like and how the robots will move, and make sure that an experiment will run on a work cell successfully before we even have to invest in those instruments. This will become particularly useful if we're designing a larger science factory, because there's a lot of parts that need to be coordinated and need to work together in order to facilitate a science at that scale. So the picture to the left is an example of, it's a copy, it's a virtual work cell that we have in the RPL. So you've got 3 Opentrons OT2s, a Hudson plate crane Cyclops arm, 2 thermocyclers, a sealer peeler, and a PF400 in that work cell. And that's the work cell that we run the color picker experiment on. The bottom right picture is also the same work cell. It's just a larger view, a virtual larger view of our whole lab. And then the one on the top is a virtual representation of the experiment in the biology division that I showed you earlier. So I want to show you this video real fast as well. So what we can do with these virtual work cells is we can kind of map out the movements of each robot and make sure that they're working together in the way that we expect them to when we run our workflows. We can work on coordinating the movements of the robots so that things are happening at the same time, and it doesn't necessarily have to be just a linear set of actions, so that we can take better advantage of the time that we have and not keep our expensive instruments idle for too long. Also, we can think about how we would design a larger science factory and how we would get these pieces working together and how we would coordinate them before we have to make that investment. Okay, so that about wraps up my presentation. I just want to mention we've been doing a lot of benchmarking experiments in the rapid prototyping lab. But now that we've shown that this can work, we have some applications in different groups we're working with at Argonne and beyond. So some of our current applications are the autonomous design of antimicrobials and small molecules, the autonomous discovery of redoximers for batteries and energy storage, as well as the development of circular plastics through waste. Then that's also through autonomous discovery. We also have a project called METAL, which stands for Mobilizing the Emerging Diverse AI Talent, which is where we're partnering with different universities to help them develop their lab automation and self-driving lab curriculum. And for that, we're trying to use WEI as an example and to help the students get started. So we're developing a minimal viable self-driving lab that these universities can purchase and they can get started with. For now, it's a basic version of our color picker application, but instead of using a robotic arm to transfer the instrument or to transfer the labware from the camera to the OT2, it's just an OT2 with purely a camera inside the system, so there's no robotic arm necessary. Another thing I want to mention is that our group at Rapid Prototyping Lab does a lot of work to help students develop these skills that are going to be needed to develop these large science factories of the future. So we do a lot of student internships, especially in the summer, and we take a lot of undergrads from the SULI program. So if you or anyone you know is interested, you can please apply to that program. And I want to say a special thanks to everyone who's working on this project, especially Raf, Vescovi, Doa, and Ryan, and Tobias. This has really been a team effort. So thank you.
Alrighty, thanks again, Casey. And on behalf of Opentrons as today's webinar sponsor, I again like to personally thank Casey for your time today and the important research that you're working on there at Argonne. And before we go, I'd also like to thank the audience for joining as well. Any questions submitted during the on-demand period will be addressed by Casey via the contact information you provided at the time of the registration. The webcast can be viewed on demand for 1 year, and Roots will alert you via email when it's available for replay. We encourage you to share that email with any of your colleagues who may also have missed today's live event. Until next time, goodbye, everybody.